Welcome back to Behind the Headlines. Last Friday evening at 6, the 2026 Missouri legislative session gavelled to a close. They approved a $50 billion plus budget. The governor got the proposal he wanted to let Missourians decide if they want to eliminate the state income tax. All in all, lawmakers sent him more bills than in the last two sessions combined. Jason Rosenbaum covers Missouri politics for St. Louis Public Radio and joins us with his list of winners and losers and takeaways for what we could call a mostly drama-free session. Welcome back, Jason. Always good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so let's start with what stood out to you in terms of what passed that would probably benefit all Missourians if the governor signs it.
There were a number of bills that passed in the last week of session that kind of centered around broad topics. There was a health care bill that includes the ability for women to get 12-month supplies of birth control. There was also a public safety bill that would expunge more nonviolent offenses automatically, which would, if somebody commits, say, a nonviolent misdemeanor, they can get it expunged without having to hire a lawyer, go to court within a year. And for some felonies, it's 3 years. There also was an elections bill that would make it much harder to pull off what our good friend, former state senator Bill Eigel, did by having these reoccurring donations that were very much powering his campaign. There also was an economic development bill that could end up transforming the AT&T building in St. Louis to residential, and that could really be a big boost to downtown St. Louis. And there's other economic development aspects in this bill that could help other parts of the state. All these things are pretty significant. They passed not with a lot of drama, but with a lot of fine-tooth negotiations. This was a really strange thing to see, Steve. I'm used to Shakespearean drama and harsh recriminations at the end of session, not legislators actually passing meaningful bills and not really getting into big spats about it. It was kind of like being in another dimension.
So what did they leave when they left that's lacking, starting with funding for public schools, the foundation formula?
Yeah, I would say that was the most notable thing, that the foundation formula will not be fully funded. That was something that Democrats in particular were very critical of and could have a pretty sizable effect on school districts, which are already going through a difficult financial time given the economic downturn and people spending less money and, potentially being in places where the revenue situation is just not as good as it was during COVID. So that is one thing. There was also not necessarily a budgetary item, but within the realm of education, the governor wanted to pass this A through F scale to grade schools. And that didn't pass. That had also been pretty controversial among educators because it would have probably given a really bad public facing look to schools that have trouble because they just may happen to be school districts in a geographic area where there's a lot of poor people and there's a lot of crime, not because the school itself is somehow defective or anything like that. So those are two things that didn't happen that I think the lack of fully funding the foundation formula was something that educators were dismayed about. The A through F scale, I don't think they were very wild about that idea, so I don't think they're shedding a lot of tears that didn't make it.
Jason, talk about the constitutional amendments that voters will decide and the political wrangling that went with that and the petition drives and the lawsuits over the petition drives. And I also wonder how much political consultants that we don't see on camera influence lawmakers.
Well, there were two constitutional amendments that passed in the last week of session. One was to reaffirm that most sheriffs will be elected in the state, which is the case for most of the state. It's not the case for my home base right here in St. Louis County. We do not have an elected sheriff near St. Charles County. It also does not apply to the city of St. Louis, which means hypothetically, if there was a push to make the sheriff a appointed position, it's still possible under this amendment. I don't know. Maybe this is a problem in other parts of the state, but I do not spend my time thinking about whether sheriffs should be elected or not. Even when we had the hubbub over Alfred Montgomery, I think the thought did cross my mind that maybe we shouldn't have an elected sheriff in St. Louis, but that's not my
Mhm.
problem personally because I don't live there. There's also one about like setting up a sovereign state wealth fund, which hypothetically, if you put a lot of money in there and it's invested really well, guess over like a 50-year period, you wouldn't have to pay taxes anymore. That's a, gonna be honest, Steve, it's a really strange idea, but maybe somebody has a few $1 billion they want to put into this fund and do that. But I don't think that's what you were talking about. You were talking
Yeah,
about the other amendments that were put on the ballot last year, particularly the one
sure.
to overturn
Yeah.
the 2025 abortion amendment. There's one to try to make it much harder to amend the Constitution that was put on during special session.
Hmm.
And of course, there's the tax. There's the tax cut plan, or the tax elimination plan, or the everything tax, or the sales tax extravaganza, depending on your point of view,
There you go.
which is really just to take the pejoratives or the positives of it, allows the General Assembly to expand the state's sales and use taxes as a means to get rid of the state's income tax. So there's a lot of things on the ballot. I think I counted at least 7 things the legislature put on the ballot.
Sounds
There's
right.
another, yeah, there's another one that could make the ballot if it has enough signatures, and there's also the redistricting referendum. So 9 things on the ballot. I do not recall a time when there were this many things on the ballot, and that's why I think there's a lot of like that's why I think there's a lot of talk about how that crowded uh, ballot item field is going to play with voters.
Yeah. We were talking earlier, and you were mentioning earlier about there wasn't a lot of Shakespeare this particular session. Republicans still dominate both the House and
Mhm.
Senate, but not as a supermajority, if my count is correct. In November, could that change? And also, do you see any changes in leadership?
Well, there's a couple of things here.
Hmm.
One of the things I noted in an article for St. Louis Public Radio is the House really didn't operate with a supermajority for the most of
Hmm.
its 2-year period because there were so many vacancies that they went below the supermajority, and Governor Kehoe never called any special elections for them at all. So there were seats that were vacant for well over a year, and that actually mattered when it came to redistricting because they didn't have enough votes to make a map go into effect right away in 2025, which left
Hmm.
it susceptible to a referendum. And that meant they couldn't pass something at the end of session this year to try and dismantle the first congressional district. They're going to have to wait till next year. And who knows if there's still an appetite for that, if there's a blue wave, which the polls, there's a New York Times poll I saw yesterday that showed Democrats are up by 11% in the generic balloting, which would be the largest blue wave probably of my lifetime. I think
Hmm.
in 1982 is a little bit more, but I wasn't born in 1982, so that would count. So there's that. Um, but it could change, especially in the House. I think if you have a terrible election night nationally for
Hmm.
Republicans, there is some insulation in Missouri because it's such a Republican state,
Hmm.
but eventually that insulation is going to wear off, and Republicans are just going to lose seats that they only won in 2024 by like 1 to 4 percentage points. So that supermajority will be pretty much. I would say it's not looking good for them to keep the supermajority in the House. Whether they keep the supermajority in the Senate, I think depends on whether they can. I think they're at 24 right now, and the supermajority is 23.
Hmm.
So if they lose 2 Senate seats, I think they're below the supermajority, which would be a big milestone for them. And those 2 seats is obviously the race in Springfield between Betsy Fogle and Melanie Stinnett,
Yeah.
and then the other one between Democrat Carrie Engel and either House Speaker John Patterson or former State Representative Dan Stacy. Those are the 2 Senate races we're all watching. We really don't have any general election ones of note in
Mhm.
St. Louis, so we're just going to look longingly to the western part of the state in jealousy.
Okay, so I don't know if your crystal ball is back at the station or there, in your home studio, but what could be the next chapter for congressional redistricting in Missouri?
Ooh, that's a
Your
great
thoughts.
question.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think it really depends on what happens with this election season. The other thing that happened while I was there was this really important decision that said that the map didn't automatically get suspended just because people, not politicians, turned in referendum signatures. And by the map, I mean the 2025
Hmm.
map.
Right.
But it also said that if Denny Hoskins, the Secretary of State, says that the referendum made the ballot or he's forced by a court to put it on there, and it's looking like option B is going to be the most likely scenario, then it says that the map was retroactively suspended as of December 9th. So that creates the possibility, I don't want to say inevitability, because it's
Hmm.
also possible that a federal judge steps in and says, nope, you got to do the 2025 map because it's
Hmm.
the one you used in the primary. But it does create this really odd, but also for election officials, frightening possibility that there's two primaries for congressional races, one in August and one I don't know, in September, October, because
Yeah.
it's ruled that the referendum made it and the map never was in place. Um, so I would say if one of two scenarios happens,
Okay.
the map never goes into effect and is overturned, or if the map does go into effect and Emmanuel Cleaver still wins, which, a lot of national prognosticators are writing Mo 5 off, and I understand why, because it's a much more Republican seat now than it was.
Hmm.
But the people I was talking with in Jeff City actually see a pretty reasonable scenario where Cleaver wins, just because, the blue wave is strong. He gets a lot of votes in Jackson County, and his margins in the rural areas are just not as bad as a typical
Hmm.
Democrat, especially because he used to represent Saline, Lafayette, and Ray counties. And it represents part of Boone County, not the more Democratic part, but still part of Boone County that has a lot of Democratic voters.
Hmm.
Yeah, I would say if it backfires, I don't know if they do what they did to Mo 5 to Mo 1, but I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to do it. Um, it's just a question of does that pressure matter by 2027 when Donald Trump is leaving office? And um, the other thing too that I don't think a lot of people have talked about is it is possible to turn the first congressional district into a seat Republicans could win, but it would require turning at least 4 or 5 seats and possibly the whole map, because you're also going to have to affect the Kansas City and Springfield areas too
That's true.
into 55, 45 Republican districts. I don't want to be I don't want to be an alarmist here for your Republican viewers, but I don't know. I don't think 55-45 is that strong. And I think if the rural counties kind of revert back to where they were before Donald Trump, it's not out of the question that Republicans lose 6 or 7 of those seats. It's a really risky venture. Um, people were saying that about what they did in Mo 5 too, and that was not compelling. So I guess we'll just have to. It's a long-winded way of saying I guess we'll see.
Yes, we'll see. All right. Jason Rosenbaum, you always make us smarter. Thank you for joining us, my friend. You can see Jason's reports on St. Louis Public Radio's website and on social media, as well as this conversation at ky3.com, the KY3 News app, also on your favorite streaming device. As always, Jason, we look forward to next time. Thank you for your time. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.